Hey there, tax fans. Welcome to State Tax Talks with me, your host, Joe Tantillo. I'm a tax attorney at the Hodgson Russ Law Firm looking to explore the nuances of state and local tax law. Here on the show, our goal is to keep tax informative, simple, and fun. So if you're ready to talk tax, turn up the volume and dive into this episode of State Tax Talks. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of State Tax Talks. I am your host, Joe Tantillo, and I am joined here today by the great Daniel Kelly. Dan, welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show, I should say. You've been a guest before, and happy to have you.
Thanks, Joe. I'm happy to be here.
Today, we are discussing California's tax residency rules. And if we could afford it, this is the part of the show where I would ask our editors to splice in a Beach Boys song over the top of my words, but we are not going to pay royalties to the Beach Boys because they're just too expensive, and I don't think the firm would let me expense that cost for my humble podcast. So instead of that, I'd like you to imagine the backtracking of California Girls is as we have this discussion today. So Dan, we are both licensed in California, which is why we are having this conversation. And the reason that we got licensed in California is because they have a set of rules that is not wildly dissimilar and yet distinct enough from New York that we felt that it would be beneficial to our client base and to future clients that we have that knowledge because California, much like New York, is an incredibly high personal income tax rate state. And so we headed out west like our forefathers of old, and we sat in Pasadena and we took the test, and lo and behold, we passed. And here we are today talking about some California tax residency rules. And I think that a good place for us to start, as we would with New York, is the concept of domicile. You say domicile, I say domicile. Let's call the whole thing off. You get that reference?
Oh, no, I understand.
Anyway, so domicile for California tax residency purposes, not crazy distinguishable from New York. But let's get into it, Dan. Why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about California's concept of domicile?
Yeah, it's a really kind of common question that we get. It's a popular issue in California, like it is in New York, like it is in other states. People who have the ability to work remotely, or who have hit a certain age, who have a career move, who have a health issue, who have really any reason at all, are thinking, well, I live in a certain state like California. Can I move someplace else? To Nevada, to Washington, to Florida, overseas, pick a place. And so the first question that should pop up in a representative's mind or a taxpayer's mind, if they know the rules, is your tax domicile. Where in fact does the taxpayer make his or her permanent primary home? And the concept of domicile in California is very similar to what you'd find in other places as well in the U.S. as far as kind of state tax domicile goes. Your domicile is your permanent primary home, the place you intend to return to when you're away. It's, kind of a subjective question where you look at the person's life, their connections, their sentiments, their personal possessions, their real property, various kind of connections someone has, and their statements of intention to determine where that domicile actually is. Our practice is often comparative, where we look at a state like California and a state like Florida, or a state like California and a state like New York. And from a domicile perspective, domicile does not kind of strictly deal with income taxes only. It's involved in personal jurisdiction. It's involved in contract law. It's involved in kind of many places, but we see it most kind of directly with respect to income tax. Because if you're domiciled in California, absent some exceptions we'll talk about briefly, you're taxable in California on your worldwide income, kind of period. Stop right there. So kind of the starting point is if you're domiciled in California, if your primary home is in California, you're taxable on everything that you earn in California unless an exception applied or unless kind of one of the carve-outs applied to you. And so, when I think about domicile, I think, look, I can have 5 residences, and sometimes folks do. I can have a boat and 2 residences. Only one of them can be my domicile. If it was historically in California, it's going to stay in California unless and until you transition it to some other location. And that burden is on the party asserting the change. So, if a taxpayer is attempting to leave California, he or she must prove their change of domicile. If the California Franchise Tax Board is trying to pull in someone to California from a domicile perspective against their will, that's on the Franchise Tax Board. And both types of those kind of skirmishes and fights exist for folks. But because domicile is often, kind of the most important in the residency planning kind of toolkit, or in just thinking about, kind of a tax liability and changing residency, we often spend the most time kind of thinking that through with clients and making sure that they understand, kind of what it takes to change domicile, what it means to be domiciled in California, and then also, what it might mean to land someplace else. And maybe, Joe, just kind of a few quick points on domicile, just kind of stuff that jumps out to me, kind of unique to California. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily unique to California, but things to think about kind of right away. Your domicile changes on a specific date. So just because you file an annual tax return, from a calendar year, doesn't mean you must be domiciled in California for that entire year. Obviously it can kind of occur at some point along the way.
Yeah, and let me jump in there, Dan. Is it like New York where that specific date should be tied theoretically to some sort of signaling event, or are they less strict on, your domicile change date, needs to occur in tandem with something specific, or rather like, okay, by this point, you've done enough to change your domicile and you can kind of claim it that way, more like the creeping domicile changes we see with New York. Is it one or the other, or maybe a combination of both?
Yeah, so changing domicile is about changing your lifestyle. It's about changing the way you live. It's about changing the way you hold yourself out to your community, to your friends. And so, it's always, I think, useful to have a taxpayer base their change of domicile out of California around an event or around an actual change that's occurring in their life. And so, when you think about needing an event, there's no specific requirement that it has to occur on your retirement date or on the date you turn 65. It's really useful to have those events occur because what it allows you to do is to point back to the franchise tax board or to whoever is going to ask and say, hey, these are the events and actions that occurred around my claim change that support it, that really are consistent with and demonstrate my good faith intent to abandon my former California domicile and take a new one up someplace else. And so what I'm thinking about and what clients should think about is, proving a change of domicile requires proving change in the way you actually live your life. It's tough to kind of have the same set of facts before the change and after the change, and all that's changing is your kind of claim of California domicile. You should have, kind of see the change come with it. And it's just certainly a better starting point to have a meaningful, shift in connection, shift in life that you can point to. In an audit, on a tax return, California offers a part-year resident filing status, which allows taxpayers to, specify on the return the exact date they left or the date that they arrived. Because it's certainly, right. We're talking about folks leaving California today primarily, but this stuff comes up and is just as important many times on the inbound side of things.
Yes.
So, you kind of have growing California connections, you're not moving, then you move at some point. Kind of when does that occur? When does the switch flip to becoming a California resident? And using those events and using that kind of change to demonstrate your intention and the exact date that then gets put on the tax return and kind of your return gets built out and consistent with that.
Right. So you've got your date in mind, you put it on your tax return, and showing that change that we just talked about, it's all well and good to have it in your mind and pick a date. But let's talk a little bit about, what is the state of California going to be looking at in terms of analyzing this subjective change of, where you intend to be your permanent indefinite home? Because when we talk about it in the New York context, it's obviously wrapped up in nice little packages, the 5 primary domicile factors. And though California is kind of looking at similar aspects of the taxpayer's life, they haven't necessarily refined it down quite as much as New York has, where it's as easy to pinpoint, if I do these 30 things and change my life in these ways, like I'll be in good shape. And probably in effect, a lot of it ends up being similar. But, let's talk a little bit about the analysis there of shifting your domicile, effectuating that change for California purposes.
Yeah, I think it's a good point because I think that there's a lot of people out there who have the impression that if I claim to move to, say, Texas has been a very popular, kind of state for outbound changes of domicile from many places, California included. I think there's been some discussion of like congressional seats leaving California and landing in Texas by virtue of the number of people who are kind of going with them.
We've definitely seen that in the maps.
And so there's migration afoot. And now people are moving into California still, certainly, very, very common. But more folks seem to be leaving kind of at the moment for whatever reason. And so when you're thinking about kind of how a change of domicile gets tested, there's a publication issued by the Franchise Tax Board that's actually quite helpful, gives many examples, gives, kind of discussion as to what domicile means, would reiterate many of the things we're talking about today and maybe go into more detail on others. But the idea is that your domicile, there's kind of no specific exact set of facts that would determine when exactly someone is domiciled in California or someplace else. But what we look at is kind of the person's entire life. What is their intention? Have they, kind of purchased a home, rented a home, found a home that can replace what they once had in California? How do they spend their time? Did they go from, kind of spending a month out of California to spending 11 months someplace else? What's the shift look like? Not just the amount of time, but the type of time, the quality of time, the tenor of the time. And are their trips back to California quick and staccato? Are they longer, like you're recuperating or relaxing or recovering? Are they, consistent with living at someone's home? Did I pack up a moving truck and take it with me? Where's my personal property? Where's my real property? What about business? Did you continue to work in California? Did you continue to kind of own substantial investment assets, real property, active business interests? Were you employed in California? Did that change to someplace else? And then kind of tens or dozens of formalities, like did you tell the franchise tax board when you were leaving that you needed to change your address? Did you file a tax return with the franchise tax board showing your new address? Did you get a new license? Did you register to vote someplace else? Did you affirmatively write to your county in California and cancel your voter registration? Mm-hmm. Things that you can do, did you cancel your primary residence exemption on your California home? So California is looking at, from a domicile perspective, and the case law suggests, and the franchise tax board's authority suggests, kind of no single set of facts that a taxpayer can just kind of look at and say, if I do all of this, I've moved. But really looking at each taxpayer, their lives, their families, their children, their work, their property, and what they've told the public and the franchise tax board to kind of get a full sense of where a taxpayer's primary home actually is. With a lot of that stuff being done kind of years after the fact. So just assume for a second that, I'm a California resident until December of 23. Then I move to Texas. I filed my 23 part-year resident California tax return in October of 24. California has 4 years under their statute of limitations to begin an audit and to assess me. So now it's 2027. I get my audit notice. I have to remember and understand and have proof of my intention back in December of 23 and in the months that followed to win my case.
Yep. What did I do 4 years ago, 3 years ago?
Exactly. And so that's just why you got to be kind of thinking about this stuff, if you can, proactively and around the time of the move. And, kind of when you move in an organic way, you create a lot of evidence you might not think is important, right? Like you send out your first holiday card and it says your new Texas address on it. Like that's a piece of evidence for your file. Mm-hmm. You get your driver's license in January of 24. That's evidence for your file. You notify your employer to adjust your withholding. Evidence for your file. You've got kind of proof along the way that would be great to kind of continue to maintain if you can think, kind of in real time to keep it.
So the short answer to my question then is they're looking at everything, which is what we always say. Like we typically, when clients call us with respect to, I'm thinking about making a move or I'm trying to avoid, moving into a state. The key is you either, when thinking about making a move, we always say, well, you really have to move. It can't be a kind of 1 foot in the old state, 1 foot in the new state scenario. And in California, that's particularly dangerous. And we'll talk about that in a second. But as we've talked about already today, it's a shift of your behavior. It's a shift of your everyday life patterns away from the prior state and toward the new state of domicile in a way that amounts to, clear and convincing evidence, but and otherwise, like, it should be really obvious to any reasonable person, I hate to use a legal term, but it should be obvious to a reasonable person that you're living in the new place. And I think when you start to get into the time splits of 6 months in a day, we hear that all the time. It's not really the test. When you're keeping a big place in California and maybe you're only renting a place in Texas or Nevada and it's an apartment, that's not necessarily going to cut it. Like, you got to show a move, which is not to say that you cannot maintain some connections to California and effectuate a change of domicile, but you have to be cautious when doing so because they have, kind of multiple levels of analysis here that can potentially keep you sucked in, even in the event that you change your domicile. And I don't know if you want to make any more points about domicile before we kind of delve forward into the next.
Yeah, maybe just a couple quick ones, just like things that we see or things we think about when you're thinking about domicile. Just, again, this is kind of like the 101 of California residency, which is often the most important part of California residency, kind of getting the big picture straight.
Yeah, domicile it's the trump card. You need to, if you change your domicile, in most cases you're going to be in good shape, and likewise, if you don't change your domicile successfully, you're going to be in trouble. So you gotta get that right.
And so a couple quick kind of common issues that come up for folks. Taxpayers are married happily in California. One spouse is ready to move, one spouse isn't. What happens? So this is not an issue in New York residency audits typically because New York is not a community property state. But California's community property state and its community property tax rules create and present new challenges. And I'm not a matrimonial practitioner, and this is where it often kind of hits the road, but it's
and
involved
none of
in
this is legal
taxation
advice anyway. So
yeah, right. And so, the reality is separate property states kind of start from the starting point that, when one spouse earns income or has an asset, it's their separate property. Mm-hmm. And, kind of when you dissolve a marriage or when you kind of chop that property up, you think about kind of equities and you think about ways in which that property should be divided amongst the spouses. But the separate property rules, kind of are common on the East Coast. They're common in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, states where many of the Eastern Coast clients are moving to Florida or Texas. Community property is kind of the rival jurisdiction, and this stems, from Europe with respect to bringing different legal codes over to the United States. But in a community property jurisdiction, spouses create a community. And so when you're married, the kind of starting place, absent a prenup agreement or a postnup agreement, or any specific carve-out that would exist, is that, the income or asset of one spouse is split between the spouses kind of in an equal way. It's part of the community that the spouses have created. It's not one spouse's property. So where this kind of plays in with domicile is if spouse one has changed domiciles from California to a community property state, they're still in a community state. They still split half their income with the spouse who stay back in California. Mm-hmm. So at a high level, the community property analysis is very critical in a domicile analysis to determine if one spouse is going to move, one spouse is going to stay in California, will you actually save tax? Will you substantially reduce your tax bill? Will it be similar? Will it be cut in half? Because spouses will share income with each other, absent an agreement otherwise, with respect to wage compensation, with respect to gains many times, with respect to kind of portfolio income on assets owned by the community, interest, dividends, capital gains, that kind of stuff on a community asset. So it just is something to be aware of. It complicates the issue some and is not going to deep dive it today with respect to the different kind of fact patterns that permeate. But when one spouse lives in a state like California and the other spouse lives really anywhere else, New York, Nevada, Texas, pick a place, you have to kind of run the community property analysis to determine whether the domicile change has really had the effect you intended, mm-hmm. or whether it's actually made things worse, or whether it's just, kind of reduced the tax but not as much as you thought. So I wanted to make that point because that's certainly something that's in California and other community states that, may not be present elsewhere. And I also would point out, if you're thinking about California domicile, thinking about changing it, as I mentioned, there's helpful information from the FTB, the Franchise Tax Board, on their website. The California Form 540-NR is the non-resident and part-year resident California personal income tax return. The Schedule NA to that form is actually pretty useful to kind of understand the type of questions that California might ask at a high level. Mm-hmm. Specifically, did you own real property in California? They want to know that right in the tax return. How many days were you in California physically? Right on the tax return. The date you moved out. How long you had been domiciled in California before you left. So these are questions that obviously have import to the Franchise Tax Board by virtue of collecting it at the time you file your return. Yep. Before they ask a single question of you, they have data about you, right? Like in an audit context.
Yeah, and they're a little more strict with making sure that those things are answered accurately. They're not ones where you can just leave it blank and...
Yeah, well, and I think that the instructions are pretty clear, right? Like if you own or have really kind of beneficial access or ownership of a property through a trust or maybe an LLC, you should be answering yes to that question. It doesn't ask about leases currently, at least the last return, which is interesting. They want to know kind of owning obviously connotes a more, kind of substantial connection than leasing, mm-hmm. or kind of having access to. But certainly outside of the kind of baseline domicile rules, the very common factors, many of these cases that are kind of coming up now in litigation, or at least, some recent cases on this issue, it's not so much that the Franchise Tax Board never agreed the taxpayer moved. It's they didn't agree as the date the taxpayer claimed. So, I claimed to move on December 15th, 2023. The Franchise Tax Board comes along and says, look, Dan, you moved on June 1st, 24. We'll let you go forever as of that point or until you move back to California. But I'm taxing you between December 15th of 23 and June 15th of 24. And the import of that can often be if you sell your company in there, you have a capital gain event, you have kind of other issues or income in that period of time, they can snag it and try and tax it while letting you go on the backside. Yep. So sometimes these cases boil down to, look, it's not a forever issue. Some are forever issues, by the way, and those are, pretty tricky. Often it's, hey, we think you moved, you did a lot of good stuff, but it just wasn't quite the date you said, which makes oftentimes really focusing on that date, building your case around that date as best you can, it just gives you a better shot on audit to prevail or, to advance your case.
And why, generally speaking, it's good to anticipate these kinds of liquidity or income events and move with some sort of runway leading up to them. Not a great idea to leave yourself 2 months before you're going to have some sort of huge capital gain event where you're going to be taxed as a California resident on that. And
yeah, I mean, look, it can be done. Obviously, it's your domicile will change on the date that you claim to move.
Yep.
But it's obviously, you have more flexibility, you have more time, you have more ability to get landed in the new location. I think at a high level, Joe, there's more to talk about domicile, but that's probably the main nuts and bolts.
The bread and butter.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. There's kind of pivoting into the other stuff. There's the 2 residency presumptions in California. Because California has like a whole second tranche of residency that's worth a discussion. There's a couple of rules that also should not be all you think of when you're thinking of California residency, but should be kind of somewhere rattling around in your head, which is that California presumes per its regulations that a taxpayer is a California resident regardless of claiming a domicile elsewhere, if you spend more than 9 months per year in the state. So if you spend more than 9 months in California, you're presumed to be a California resident. You can rebut that presumption in situations like where you clearly have left California. Or if you're working on a 1-year employment contract in California, perhaps you can rebut the 9-month presumption because that's just a limited or temporary time in California.
Yep.
It's all facts and circumstances based, but I think 9 months is around 270 days in the year. I think that's California's point is like, look, if you're in our state for that much time, you're probably a resident under some conception of our law. So you got to rebut and prove otherwise.
Yeah.
So that's always kind of in our heads is like, hey, all these facts, your homes, your family, et cetera. What about your time? Not to just kind of trump to time, but time is always very important, if only from, this potential presumption. The other is a safe harbor. So the California regs contain a safe harbor that says if your domicile is in another state and you own a home there or maintain a home in that state, you can be a California non-resident even if you have a place in California and you spend up to 6 months of the year in California. So basically, many older cases in California involve situations where California was, kind of assessing the snowbird types as California tax residents who had a place in Palm Springs and, the beautiful climate that California attracts folks from across the world, the Northeast, Canada, pick a place, kind of during the winter months. And so California safe harbor is useful for a lot of your retiree crowd and kind of the vacationer crowd who wants to spend up to half the year in California, have a place there. To fit into that safe harbor, it's really important to not take actions in California that would be inconsistent with being a vacationer or retiree.
Yeah.
Like you can't go hang a shingle and start being a part-time CPA. That would take you out of the safe harbor.
Yep.
You might still win your case under the kind of ordinary residency rules, but the safe harbor is really only useful for people who don't have a kid in school in California, don't work in California, haven't voted in California, right? That's not a vacationer.
Yeah, it's limited in its scope and it exists for primarily the purpose of allowing people to vacation in California so that they're not losing, income from that crowd in terms of, sales tax paid and money brought into the
Sure, and those folks
stuff.
Often maintain very nice homes and they have homes that, have property tax and they support the economy and yes, some of them fly close to the residency sun, but the idea is that it's tough to pull them in on their domicile basis because their domicile's still back in New York, right? They have their main home there. All their stuff's still there. They vote in New York. They file taxes in New York. Their intent is to be domiciled in New York, but their connections are really creeping towards California. So that safe harbor just gives folks a somewhat brighter line in a pretty murky residency landscape that they can often work with. And the third point I'll mention is a fairly limited employment-related safe harbor where folks who go overseas in relation to an employment contract, I think it's for 546 days is the period that we look at.
Yep. Right.
And who don't spend more than, I think I'm drawing a blank on what the number is. I believe it's 45 days.
That sounds right.
Yeah, it's either 30 or 45.
It's a small number of days.
Yeah. Are allowed to pay taxes as a California non-resident during that period that they're abroad and spending limited time back in California with other restrictions. Basically, you cannot have significant capital gain or other non-wage related income. I think $250,000 of kind of non-wage income takes you out of that potential exemption. You can't use this for an exemption in relation to your employment to shield big capital gain, unrelated or related to your employment, basically.
Yeah.
But suffice to say that there's a technical, albeit narrow, additional exception that could sometimes apply to, allow a taxpayer to avoid paying taxes as a California resident.
We could certainly do a lengthy deep dive on this domicile issue specifically. I mean, we really haven't even talked about the nuances of a lot of specific cases. So this provides an excellent opportunity to kind of shift into the next phase of the analysis of California's residency rules, which is the temporary transitory purpose analysis. which, comes with it, the closest connections analysis, and we'll get into how those two things are related. This is a good time to bring part one of this discussion to a close on the issue of domicile, and unfortunately we're out of time for today, but we will pick up this Intro to California Tax Residency with myself and Dan Kelly next time on part 2 of this series, where we'll be delving into the temporary or transitory purpose test. Until then, this is State Tax Talks. I've been Joe Tantillo. See you next time. Thanks for joining us for another episode of State Tax Talks. If you're interested in listening to more episodes, we're available on all platforms where podcasts can be found, including YouTube. If you enjoyed this episode of State Tax Talks with Joe Tantillo, please give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're in need of a tax professional, you can contact the tax attorneys at Hodgson Russ. Go to www.hodgsonruss.com for more information. And until next time, I'm Joe Tantillo, and this is State Tax Talks. Catch you later, tax fans. The comments contained in this podcast do not constitute legal advice. The opinions herein are the opinions of the speakers and not the official opinion of the Hodgson Russ Law Firm.